Hey guys, Mark Ryan here. On this episode of Micromatic, we're going to talk about the advanced characteristics of aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. So in the last video, we talked about the basics of aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. If you haven't watched that video, go ahead and go back and catch up because I'm not going to go over how those elements contribute to exposure. That's what we went over in the first video. In this video, I want to talk about sort of the advanced characteristics of aperture, ISO, and shutter speed and how they affect your image, because they each, even though they each contribute to exposure, they also contribute to other aspects of your photograph, and they're each different. Let's take aperture, for example. Aperture, as we talked about in the last video, controls how much light comes into the camera, but it also determines the depth of field that you're going to see in your photograph. And when I talk about depth of field, I'm talking about the amount of the image that's in focus. For example, let's say you're taking a lens like this one I'm using right now. It stops down to f1.8. f1.8 is pretty wide open, and that's going to give you a really narrow depth of field. If you're shooting a portrait of a subject, you might find that at f1.8, a very small portion of the subject's face becomes in focus. You might take the photograph and then kind of look at it afterwards, zoom in, and you'll see that the bit in focus, the depth of field, is really only covering the subject's eyes. You know, you might even notice that as close as the nose is out of focus, because at f1.8, your depth of focus, your depth of field is really, really narrow. Conversely, if you stop that lens down to f5.6 or f8, you're going to increase that depth of field quite a bit. Let's say you take that exact same portrait of your subject, you're going to find that not only are the eyes in focus at f5.6, but even the background is in focus. And so you can see how this might affect your photograph. If you're shooting a portrait, a lot of times it's nice to have that narrow depth of field where you get the focus on the eyes and the focus in the face where you really want to draw the audience's attention. But then the focus kind of falls off in the background. You get kind of a nice creamy background that really complements and flatters the subject. But when you're taking a picture like a landscape, you don't really need that narrow depth of field to draw attention to what you're taking a picture of. You need everything in focus. And so that's where it's really good to stop the lens down to f5.6. And then that really, it expands the depth of field so that you can get more in focus. You can get the foreground in focus where maybe you've got a lake, and then you get the background in focus as well, or maybe you have mountains, or you've got stars, or whatever it is that you're taking a picture of. And so that's how aperture can affect your photograph, apart from just the exposure. There's one other significant area that aperture affects on your photograph, and that's sharpness. Now, this is something that varies by lens to lens, so take this as more of a rule of thumb rather than a hard and fast rule. But how sharp your photograph is, right? That's kind of, we're talking about the fineness of the details in the photograph varies depending on your aperture. A lot of the times a lens that's wide open at say f1.8 will actually be a little bit soft. If you zoom in on the details, you'll kind of notice that you still have those details there. They're in focus, but there's a little bit of softness to them. Whereas if you take that same lens and you stop it down to f2.8, maybe even f4, you're gonna find that not only is your depth of field wider, but the details that you have in focus become sharper. They become fewer, it's called chromatic aberrations. It's kind of, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but you'll usually see it as kind of purple fringing on one side of the image or on one side of the focus, and green fringing, which is kind of just a faint outline of color around the parts that are in focus. So now ISO affects your photograph in a completely different way, and unlike aperture and shutter speed, ISO is the one thing where it's always good to keep the ISO as low as possible. There's really no benefit to boosting your ISO. And what ISO usually does is it kind of adds grain into the photograph, okay? When I talk about grain, this is something that at low ISOs you're not really gonna see unless you zoom in really close in the photograph. But at higher ISOs, and when I say high ISO, this kind of varies from camera to camera, but let's say 1600 and above, if you zoom in on the details of the photograph, you'll find that noise is kind of muddying up the details. It's reducing some of the color quality of the photograph. And the other thing that ISO does is it tends to make it harder to to push the photograph in post-production. So let's say you take a picture of your friends in a dark area and the ISO gets bumped up to 3200. You might find that when you take that photograph into post-production, say Photoshop or Snapseed or whatever you're using, and you try to brighten up that photograph, because it was taken at high ISO, you're not gonna get as much detail out of it as you brighten up that photo. As you were kind of pushing the darks, you're not gonna have captured some of the details that you would have captured if you had used a lower ISO. So again, ISO is one of those things where it's always best to use it as low as possible. There's no benefit to having a higher ISO except that it's going to help you get the exposure that you want, right? So if you're trying to save a certain f-stop, right, you want it at f5 because you want that depth of field, and you want to maintain a decent shutter speed because you don't want motion blur, you don't want your hands to shake. That's when you're going to need to bump up the ISO. But otherwise, when you're out shooting in the field, just keep the ISO as low as possible. And that brings us to shutter speed. Again, when we're talking about shutter speed, we're talking about how long your camera sensor is being exposed to the light, or how long it's being exposed to the scene around you that you're trying to photograph, right? So the longer the shutter speed, the more motion you're gonna get in that photograph. Maybe this is something you're doing intentionally, right? Maybe you're taking a photograph of a car driving by and you want to instill a sense of motion in that photograph. You might use a slower shutter speed and kind of take the photograph as you're following them, and what that'll do is that'll create motion in the background. Because you've used a slower shutter speed, you've exposed the sensor to you've exposed the sensor to that motion. I don't know, let's see how I can explain it. If you take a photograph, let's say that is a 1 second exposure, that's a really long exposure. Things can move pretty far within a second. For example, if you took a picture right now with a 1 second exposure, my finger would follow all the way across my face, and the photograph that you would have is a photograph of my face with a finger streak kind of smudged across it. And so maybe that's a good way to understand shutter speed and how a longer shutter speed can impart motion. On the other side of the coin, shutter speed and high shutter speeds specifically can freeze motion. Let's say you are taking a picture of a fountain and there's water crashing down from the fountain, right? To your naked eye, you're not seeing the individual water drops. But if you take a high-speed shutter to it, let's say 1/8,000th of a second, you take a photo of it, you might actually see the individual drops of water coming down. And that's because that really high shutter speed has frozen the motion for that photograph. And that's really it. Now you should know the basics of shooting your camera in manual mode. You know aperture, you know ISO, you know shutter speed. Those are the three main controls you're gonna see when you go out and you try and shoot that camera manual. Now, don't let that suggest that manual is the only real way to shoot, right? Taking pictures in automatic modes is just as valuable. And in fact, there are automatic modes where having this knowledge will help you a lot. Primarily, I shoot in aperture priority mode. It's because I know how aperture works that makes me want to shoot in aperture priority mode. If there are particular scenes where I know I want to impart a sense of motion, I'm going to go into shutter priority mode, and I'm going to focus on the shutter speed and how that's going to affect my photograph. And it's still an automatic mode in that the camera is going to handle the aperture and it's going to handle the ISO for me. If you found that helpful, consider hitting the like button down below and maybe share the video with a friend. You're gonna see my cat in a little bit, and if you don't subscribe, she's gonna be really disappointed. All right, I'll see you next time on the next episode of Micromatic.